Hello and welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're back. I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich and I serve Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
I'm Pastor John Boyd and I serve St. George's Anglican Church here on the North Shore of Kamloops, British Columbia.
And coming back from our vacation time, we are delighted and honored to share a conversation with longtime friend and Kamloops resident, now Victoria resident, Corey Keith. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So this is quite exciting. A little bit about me before we get into the topic. So I have my own private practice, so I do a lot of counseling, consulting, training, organization, primarily around sexual and gender diversity, amongst other things. And there's actually a book that just got published about my life story, and it talked about the intersections of my journey around my gender and my spiritual path. And I also just started a Facebook group called Rainbow Spirit Community. So it's a safe space for anyone within the queer LGBTQ2S+, the acronym, a safe place for people to explore their spirituality no matter where that is, and connect to resources, mentors, community, all of those kind of things. So I have lots more, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us today.
Mm-hmm.
Our topic this morning is how our life experience has affected our faith journey. Part of what we were enjoying thinking about this topic is the diversity that is expressed even within a denomination or within a tradition.
At the age of 3 and older, I was much more aware of my surroundings and conscious of the experiences that I was having and the groups of people that my parents were socializing with. My mother was a pastor at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Manhattan, in New York City, which was a very diverse congregation, especially during the 80s and the height of the AIDS/HIV crisis in the United States. And I grew up with looking at a human mosaic and being immersed in that and being incredibly curious about everybody's story, and also learning about everyone's story in the midst of hearing our shared story in faith as people of God. So my spirituality was marked by worship on Sundays, but then a gathered community meal that was provided for everyone, and then just a lot of visitation and learning about people and spending time with them. So for me, my faith journey starts and is mostly centered around community, and community that is family and includes a lot of different people. That changed as I got older. But how about you?
With my father having been a pastor who's now retired, but as a child served as a chaplain in the Victoria Wanda Fuqua Care Hospital System. And so at the time, I thought everybody went to church on Sunday mornings and then had church again in an assisted living facility in the afternoon. Doesn't everybody do that? And I would say it wasn't until I was into elementary school that I really recognized that there was difference between my life and my faith journey and others. And that would have been because as a child on a farm, we had everything happening kind of around the farm or around the church. And then once I got into elementary school and would talk with friends about what they were up to on the weekends and things they were doing, then started to learn that there were even differences within Christianity. And that was fascinating. I still remember talking with Philip in grade 5 about infant versus believer's baptism. And how there was that difference between the two of us as 10-year-olds, how we kind of understood our own traditions around baptism is still fascinating to think back on. But all in all, very positive. Life of faith was a community that was supportive, and my life experience on the farm really brought me in tune with creation and a sense of God being with me everywhere, and certainly outside and as part of that. And so I would say that my life experience nourished and supported my faith journey at that time of my life when I was younger. Yeah. What about you?
So for me, definitely a little different. So my family were pretty much atheists, right? And my aunt and uncle were strong Christians. They were missionaries and traveled the world doing that. And they gave me an old comic book Bible. And I had read it through. I was right into it and the whole thing, right? And then I convinced my parents to take me to church. And they grudgingly did it.
Yeah.
But something happened that was fascinating. All of a sudden there was this block. When I would go to Sunday school, I was disinterested. And I think it's only been recently where I've come to the realization is because it was coming from someone else's perspective of their interpretation rather than me finding my own interpretation. But being, a young youth, it's hard for someone to put that together.
Definitely.
Right? So not knowing what that was, I backed away. I went right into atheism. But there was something that really was a calling for me from early on. I wanted to be an astronaut, go into space. I wanted to do all of those things. But I also had a calling around diversity. And so I really wanted to put together events around supporting and advocating diversity. And even though for me, at that time, I wasn't spiritual in any way, maybe the closest I could use the word humanist, I wanted to bring different faiths together and have people learn from each other. But during that time, it's always fascinating because you start to get to know the leaders of different faiths, and then certain ones you are more drawn to than others. And at that time, I was definitely more drawn to Buddhism, right? And so that drew me in, just the teachings, the life story of Buddha, all of those things really, because it was about compassion and love, but also about that discipline, the mind discipline. And the more you do that, the more you can heal and contribute to society. And that really drew me in. And so, but it was also this interesting dichotomy that I was starting to see happening, faith versus science. And I was very much into the science. I wanted to be an astronaut, maybe meet some extraterrestrials, all of those kind of things, right? And studying physics and love physics, the more theoretical, the better, right? But something happened within the study of science that was, I think, a spiritual awakening for me. The concept of the butterfly effect. For those that don't know, the butterfly effect is basically the idea if a butterfly flaps its wing in one area of town, it causes a storm on the other side of the planet. It's a metaphor, but what it really shows is the interconnectedness of all beings. And so, pulling all that together, for me, it was really about diversity and it was about the interconnection of all things. And that there doesn't have to be a duality between science and faith and all of these different things. There is something there for everything. So.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I will say once I got beyond elementary school and moved into older years, then I probably experienced a little more pushback as being either the good girl or, people checking to see if I was going to be the naughty girl because I went to church.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't really all that much obvious, or I was I was less inclined to let people know about my faith. And so my life experience for a chunk of time from about, I'd say even middle school through high school, said, keep your faith to yourself. And my life experience was really about splitting and having my experience of worship and service as part of a faith community and practice and whatnot stay home and apart, and the rest, if I was volunteering with a group, that was because of the heart I had as a person of faith, but I wouldn't share with people so much what I believed. And definitely with friends at school, I was always very cautious, not wanting to be cast in one light or another. And so, those next set of years for me were certainly nothing to do with being a pastor, as I had intended vocations of being a veterinarian, probably with that throwback to the farm years previously. But definitely a sense of keeping public life and personal faith separate.
That would be my experience growing up in the United States. You wouldn't recognize it now based on all of the ways in which Christianity, especially religion, has gotten twisted into politics. But then, and I mean then in terms of when we moved out of New York to Philadelphia, into a suburban parish on the outskirts of inner city Philadelphia. And that parish was more, I would say, typical in terms of my experience with Lutheran churches. There was almost no diversity whatsoever. The school that I went to was what we called integrated at the time. And it was also one of my first exposures to people of other faiths. We had Jewish students, we had students who identified as Muslim, mainline like Sunni or Shia, and also the Nation of Islam, which was founded in the United States. And for me, religion and spirituality were never talked about. They were simply assumed. It's okay, so everybody has faith and they have their different beliefs. And interestingly enough, it was just kind of instinctual or natural in that we respected each other's faiths simply by not getting into the discussion. But I guess, again, that's very American, right? So freedom of religion and freedom in spirituality there is more interpreted as freedom from religion and spirituality, because it's just not discussed, like who you're voting for. And that got to be very interesting because there were things going on in the local parish in my own journey of faith that I think took on a more darker tone. Like, it was the first experience I ever had of politics in the parish. What we now call, bullies or clergy killers, kind of pushing back, and there was a group of people who saw the church as kind of their own social experiment and club. And so my mother was there to bring this diversity and growth to the congregation, and this select core group just pushed back as hard as they could, which helped me understand a little bit more of my own location as a Lutheran. There was a little less naivete in those years and more putting complexity of understanding to what was more of a childlike experience of faith in my younger years. And then, of course, everything just went to pot in a handbasket in high school. Everything just fell apart. But that's a whole other story. What about for the two of you?
So, where do I start with this? Because I think with my story there's a bit of a complexity. So, because in our family, coming from an atheist perspective, basically, although my parents were often teaching you to respect all faiths and belief systems, as I got older, the truth kind of came out that there was prejudice there. And some of it was legitimate, as you've alluded to. There's a lot of hate and whatever that some churches perpetuate. And as I started figuring out who I was as a transgender person, pansexual, and where diversity was very much important, there certainly was this pushback for me against Christianity as a whole. So of course, for me as exploring Buddhism was definitely an option, although I started to realize sometimes there's prejudice there too, where one of the monks who came in from one of the larger cities, I grew up in Alberta, so that'll give you context, and in Red Deer, because they wasn't big enough to have a monk permanently there, they would bring someone in from Edmonton or Calgary, and that monk had bias towards gay people. And my friend was also gay, or queer, and so, and I had much more of a social justice lens of like, that's not okay. And there's a belief in Buddhism where you can't question the monk, and I find that problematic.
Interesting.
That's changing, thank goodness. I'll get into that probably later. But I started exploring things like paganism and other things, which is very, for the most part, like all faith has its own problems, but it's very much much more open, those kind of things. So I started exploring faiths that would lend itself more to being with a queer identity, a trans identity, and starting exploring what that meant to me, and finding space within that. And it was just one of those things of finding where I fit. And because I also it wasn't until my older years that I realized that my own spiritual connection, I do believe in past lives, and so there have been past lives with Indigenous lives, and some of those ways of knowing, without me consciously knowing what those are, would come through. And so connecting to indigenous spirituality and those kind of things, and then learning, oh, I'm white, I gotta be careful about that too. The difference between, okay, that's a past life, this is present life, how do you navigate those two? And just trying to find my space and connection. And so, like, for my parents, they were very, for the most part, understanding around me being trans. Sometimes they had to grapple their head around it because I'm non-binary. I don't identify as either male or female. So they had to grapple their brain around that a little bit. But for the most part, they were pretty open. Me coming out to them as spiritual was probably harder, which is ironic. And my one brother went into a Christian cult, extreme and very negative towards diversity and things like that. And so there was this contrast that we saw, but from my parents' perspective, it was the same. And it was like this very interesting thing that was going on. So trying to have that conversation of the nuance, I think, was very important.
Yeah, complicated.
Yeah,
and I would say as I moved into university, having been in high school in a city of 10,000-ish, in a high school of about 2,700 students the year I graduated, meant there wasn't that much diversity in that smaller town at the time, but that moving to the big city of Vancouver and studying at UBC, there was grand diversity there. And so that was really when I started to have a voice again, to speak about what it meant to me to be a person of faith, and as a Lutheran Christian, what that actually meant, and not just to recite the creed or say the Lord's Prayer and engage those Sunday school learnings, but to really have someone say, well, no, but what does that mean to you? And think more deeply about it. And then to engage other faiths and meet people from a variety of traditions. and have those awkward moments of asking your friend who's Muslim why they don't wear a turban. But you learn and discover that that is a Sikh tradition, not part of Islam. And so I would say that through university, I tried and visited a few other Christian denominations, especially when I had friends who were Baptist and Pentecostal and Mennonite and Brethren and from a variety of traditions who wanted to share their worship experiences. That was very interesting, but it mostly showed me that I'd been pretty well grounded in what I was brought up with as a Lutheran Christian. And my life experience through that time showed me that within that diversity, as you're describing, I still had a sense that there were a lot of people out there who had faith, whereas my high school and middle school experiences had said, oh no, the world is atheists and you better keep your faith quiet and at home. And so it was kind of with new eyes that I thought, I can step into this with a little more confidence. And spent some time traveling, and through those experiences was very much encouraged to think about what my faith meant and how that became a strength for me. And so the life experiences of being apart from family around on the other side of the world and in living in community with people who were different, in some cases still under the Christian umbrella, in other cases quite diversely different and apart from the Christian faith entirely, showed me that the grounding and faith that I had within me was a strength that got me through, even when there were these moments or days or weeks in a few cases where I would feel lost or alone, and that even on the other side of the world I wasn't. And so I would say the life experience tested my faith on a variety of levels and encouraged me to find meaning there and allowed me to meander and kind of experiment and experience a few other things, but ultimately showed me the strength of faith that I had been raised with and encouraged me to continue to find strength in that faith.
As I alluded to, high school was really a turning upside down of everything. When I was 11 and a half, my father told me that he had HIV/AIDS. And in the early 90s, that was a death sentence. So the question became, how much time do we have and what does that mean? There was, of course, the initial fear that anybody else in the family had it, which we did not. But that began kind of, again, a further removal of the veneer of kind of this childlike assumption and existence, this unquestioning kind of living into a faith community with the church, which in some ways you miss after a while, because the more you know and the more questions you ask and the deeper you go, the more I think there's paradox and things that seem dissonant within understanding what it is to be a Christian. And at this time, my mother became a professor of liturgy and homiletics at a Lutheran seminary. We moved to Saskatoon, so I'd completely changed the country that I lived in and the context I was living in. Went to church at a Lutheran congregation in the neighborhood. But because of my mother's involvement in teaching the depth of the Christian faith from a Lutheran perspective and was forming pastors, I became interested in why people go to seminary and what this all means, and began reading a little bit on my own. Probably not the best starting material. I went in and picked up, the 3-volume Systematic Theology by Paul Tillich and started reading it, and it was just like, this is different. Okay. Which was good, but when I graduated high school and went back to the States for university, the problem there in my life experience is that it was then completely removed from the church, especially through that period halfway through college, my undergrad degree when my father died. So the closest church was like 5 miles up the road, and I didn't have a car. And it was Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which at the time I just didn't really have the energy or desire to wrestle with that difference. I would say that faith was always there. I was just now asking pointedly, where does God show up in all of this? And if God is God, why does there seem to be such a disconnect between reality and the world as I'm experiencing it and people's understanding of reality and purpose in life? It was very frustrating because I was taking classes on art and spirituality and working towards being a professional artist or somebody who taught art. This is interesting. The entire history of European art from the early Middle Ages on is involved in the church. And we are specifically in this program not talking about that. In fact, we're avoiding it, and we're doing everything we can not to talk about Christianity. And the emphasis is all around, the individual, your vision, your way of making work, your worldview and your philosophy. And I thought, I'm not really interested in just myself. What is the actual human purpose of this? What good is it for?
Interesting.
So, after I graduated, I didn't pursue further education in fine art. I wanted to. I just kind of flopped around a little bit and then worked construction with my uncle for a number of years, and that was so pleasant I decided to pick up the phone and call my mother and beg her to look for some sort of graduate program that I could get myself involved in, because I did not want to work construction anymore after that. And that brought me back in a roundabout way to being involved in the church. So
through that time, would you say your life experience challenged your faith or contributed to a more individual path of seeking, or life experience meant that you kind of had to walk away from it for a while?
I think all of the above. I think it's very astute. I mean, that is a way in which I would never think to say it, but that's very clearly what happened. You're absolutely right. Because the big drive behind all that, as you say, was my seeking answers to questions and just being hungry for that answer, which meant sometimes, yes, I had to walk away because it's like, I'm not getting anywhere with this and nobody has the answer. So, yeah, definitely.
Makes sense, and I think that's not uncommon for a lot of people. Yeah, definitely. So what about your journey?
So what John was saying triggered a lot of things in my mind, and there's kind of 3 pieces that's evolving from this point in my story. Is that I started to be fascinated by religion and faith from multiple perspectives. From a historical perspective, because whether we like it or not, religion has affected all of humanity for better or for worse. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Secondly, I was starting, and I'll be honest, I was starting to get into conspiracy theories and all of that, and going in that dark rabbit hole, which, but eventually I started figuring out something, that there was this theme that was happening that I started to realize, is that the people in power were working towards making sure that we did not connect to our power, right? What is that? It was often destroying documents and history that could lead us the way to how to connect to our power. And so it was a realization about, well then, what are these documents? What are these teachings that are being trying to be hidden? Right? I've been lucky where I've been a student of Tantra, which is not necessarily sexual, but can be, but it's really a Buddhist mechanism and Hindu mechanism to really tap into your power. I started doing some research in the Gnostics, and for those that don't know, so my understanding of the history is that during the early days of Christianity, there was hundreds of sects of Christians, and then one sect decided to become, we want to be the only one, and we're going to be patriarchal and burn all the other documents and kill people who don't agree with us. More or less. It's more complicated than that, but it's...
No, it's, pretty good summary of history.
Yes, and so some of those documents, when you look at the Book of Thomas, the Book of Mary Magdalene, and a few others, when you look at those quotes in there, they are directly asking you to be authentic, because that's your power. They're directly asking you these kind of things, and it was almost in a language like Buddhism, and so I'm like, okay, something's going on here. There is this thread of truth that is happening throughout all of the great religions, but why is very few people actually talking about that thread of truth, and why? And what is the power behind that thread of truth? Each one talks about compassion and love and really unity, right? And that's what started to want to dive deeper into this, and this dissidence, as you were talking about, between these greater truths and what people are being taught. And how do we create a connection back to that? So that's one thing. And then the other piece that really started to, as I was exploring, because of my gender identity becoming a primary piece of my life, and seeing the contrast of the world and me, and how do we as different people navigate the world, and how is there this connection with spirituality for trans people, queer people, and all of those kind of things. I took an Indigenous college, Indigenous course at Red Deer College, and there was a topic on Two-Spirit people there. And for those that don't know, Two-Spirit is a sacred role of what we call in the West world LGBTQ people in Indigenous. And they were given a special role where they were seen as shamans, teachers, mediators, the whole shit, yeah. And so each nation would be different, they would have a different name, but it was this sacred role. And obviously they looked at it from a different angle than we do in the West, which is very physical, those kind of things. And because, like I said, I had this connection and I didn't really know what it is, I was automatically drawn to it. And it was the first time there was something solid that was drawing the connection between my gender identity and my spirituality. Creating the point that these two things are not separate. They're very linked. And that my whole journey of figuring out myself is a spiritual journey. And my realization about my processing of coming to terms with my physical body in this spiritual life is all one and the same. So going and doing research, and we've talked a lot about this, about, one of the stories in a Jewish text about the atom. And for those that don't know, before Adam and Eve, there was the atom, and the atom was a single androgynous being that was on a higher energy level and had wisdom and knowledge. And then at some point God had decided, let's split the atom into Adam and Eve and divide it. but that Adam was originally supposed to be a model for humanity. And so here is in in these ancient texts, a realization that there was a place for gender diversity, and that it was part of the model, right? And it's not to say everyone had to be the same, but it was saying that everyone is part of that place. And so looking at that started the journey of asking the question at the root, does all the great faiths actually say that? And obviously that's an ongoing journey, and my connection to Buddhism and whatever is stronger for me. And I've certainly found some answers in regards to that as well, and want to do more research. But it's one of those things that, because queer trans people have been so harmed by religion, the automatic reaction is to push back. And that's understandable. Very understandable. But I think in doing that, we are missing something deeper and higher that not only can uplift yourself in moving through all the shit that we navigate, but through knowing that we can also uplift others, right? It gives you a sense of power, whatever that looks like for you, right? So,
thank you. So thinking about all of this and the interweaving of life experience and how that can split us apart from our faith, and then eventually it does bring us back to a recognition that as a whole person, spirituality and life experience are interconnected and absolutely part of who we fully are. And I would say, as we're thinking about what it means to be Lutherans and Anglicans, and that there is similar life experiences quite likely among people living in this community, and yet a diversity even within those expressions of denominations, that working together in the way that we do as Anglicans in Canada and Lutherans in Canada, we have a real advantage in being able to then engage a wider diversity of expressions, and also to listen and learn from faith traditions beyond our own, because we've worked on this relationship already. And so as I think about how there has been the parting and the coming back together of what it means to be a person of faith throughout each of our lives in various ways, I'm grateful to have had this conversation, and I look forward to how it will go when we talk with Lutherans and Anglicans tomorrow. That's Thursday morning from 10 to 11 a.m. online on Zoom. Just watch for that link in your email or find it on the Hills of Peace Facebook page. So thanks again for being with us today, Corey.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching.